I am delighted to be joined this evening by a panel of authors and editors in the field of Mormon literature to talk about specifically Mormon genre literature, our current state and our possible futures. I have asked each of the panelists to take some extended bit of time to introduce not only themselves, but talk a little bit about the publications that they work with or represent, and kind of where they see the current state of Mormon genre literature being. And then I have some questions for them, and we'll talk about those questions. And then if you have questions, please put them in the YouTube chat, and we'll try to get to those as well. So I am delighted to be joined by Dave Butler, Therick Jepson, Annette Lyon, Joe Monson, and Jennifer Quist. And we are actually just going to go ahead and go in alphabetical order. So Dave, if you wouldn't mind, take it away.
I wondered if you were going to make us figure out who was first. I'm Dave. So I guess to sort of give some landmarks in my writing and publishing and editing career from a Mormon literature point of view. The first novel I published was called City of the Saints. My first agent had dropped me. I'd written it while I had an agent and published it after he told me he had no time for me and copied his lawyer. I had written it with the expectation that he wouldn't be able to sell it anyway, because it's a steampunk novel set in the Kingdom of Deseret in the year 1859 about rival secret agents Sam Clemens, Edgar Allan Poe, Richard Burton, and Eliza Snow. And I thought, the audience is probably not in New York for this, but I wanted to write it anyway. So wrote that, published it by myself, subsequently picked up by an independent publisher in Colorado called Wordfire Press. That led to me eventually publishing. I proposed to a Utah indie publisher called Immortal Works. And I know the owner, Jason King. I'd said to him, "Hey, there's a lot of overlap between Mormonism and the genre steampunk, and I think we ought to explore that by publishing an anthology." And he said, "Okay, great." And I said, "And when there's way more people who want to write in this than you think, we're going to do multiple volumes." He said, "Sure, whatever." So we did 4, and the first volume, maybe as representative of all the volumes, made I'm going to get the title wrong, but the 100 lists, the list of 100 works of significant Mormon literature, or whatever the exact title is. We made 4 volumes of some 80-odd Mormon steampunk stories. Joe and Therick both actually have stories in that. And my apologies, Annette and Jennifer, I don't remember whether you do. No, okay. Man, I don't know how you missed that train. Everybody else got on it. So I guess my publishing and editing career includes a fantastic 2020-2021 event. If you are not familiar with people at the Lee Library like Trevor Alford and Danon Scheme and Christopher McAfee and their associates, you should be. They do a lot to support and encourage Mormon literature, including in 2021. They reached out to me and said, "Dave, we had this budget for a live event. Everybody's now staying home. We want to do something else. We want to significantly overpay Mormon writers to write a short story for us to display in the Lee Library." And so I got to help curate that, writing the contract and the invitation letter, and putting together a list of writers and reaching out to them. The Cunning Man and the Jupiter Knife are a pair of novels I published with a national Gentile publisher, Bain Books, which are technically the genre is occult detective. I think it's about a 1935 sugar beet farmer from Lehi, Utah, who uses his grandma Hetty's traditional magical lore to battle the demons of the Great Depression. We'll probably write a third one this summer. Sort of surprised they went for it, but they did. I've written various kind of Mormon, always basically genre short stories, including The Guns of Perdition, an anthology edited by William Morris, States of Deseret, Mormon Alternate History. Wild Woman Hath Come Among Us, which was based on the what if question. What if you had a sterility plague and women outnumbered men 9-1? What would happen in Utah? So it was about an outlaw named Tamara Young interrupting the spring bridal train, bringing young girls in to marry the bishops. So that's those are the Mormon landmarks of my publishing, some of them anyway. I was for 3 years the acquisitions editor at Wordfire Press in Colorado. I have been for about 1.5 years now. An editor at Bain Books, which again is a national science fiction and fantasy publisher. And I feel like I've taken more than my 5 or 6 minutes, so maybe I should wait and say later things about how I see the genre right now.
That would be totally fine, Dave.
Okay.
All right, Eric, let's hear from you.
All right, so to keep it short, let me just talk about what Ariantum's published since I became editor. Of the 9 issues since I've been editor, Ariantum, Joseph and the Devil, and The Plan are mostly or entirely genre works. But genre can appear at any time. For instance, in a recent long poetry issue, you have Steve Peck's post-apocalyptic tale, Mine About Kids Catching a Dragon, and a poem by Daniel Cooper in whatever genre Dante's Inferno is. And long poetry is probably not something stereotyped as genre. Now, we all know what genre is, but we likely have our own gradations of definition. So let me tell you mine. To me, genre is more a marketing designation than a literary one. It means that readers enter a text expecting a certain set of rules to be followed, or at least a certain percentage of the genre's rules. Of course, a good writer can accomplish a lot within those rules, and with the audience's trust, even break them or ignore them entirely. But that trust is built by understanding the genre's rules and the commercial agreement that they represent. And rules evolve. I just finished reading a collection of stories from what Joshua Glenn has named the Radium Age, and the stories were great, but they're operating before the codification of science fiction as a genre. One of the stories was absolutely functioning, however, within the rules of the utopian genre. And genres meld and flow, combine, and they separate over time. So incidentally, 2 stories from The Plan, a recent Ariantum issue, both basically science fiction, are shortlisted for the AML award to be awarded later this weekend. But all the short stories and short story collections so shortlisted this year are arguably genre, and half the novels as well. Genre has been well represented at the AML Awards since switching to the shortlist first format, and that's appropriate, not just because so many Latter-day Saint writers are working in the genres, but because bringing in Mormon concepts and constructs is one great way to stretch the rules that help the genres evolve. The nature of Ariantum is such that, of course, our genre submissions tend to have deeply Mormon elements. The upcoming genre issue, edited by William and Liz Busby, will make this interplay explicit, but it's inherent in everything genre tinge that we publish. Ariantum is a, quote, literary, unquote, journal, but literary fiction can be as staid and rule-bound as the least inspired ode opera. And what I personally mean when I say literary is writing that looks for the edges of audience expectation and exploits them, breeding the new. It's like genres slowly collapse on themselves like a dying star, but that creates the opportunity for a new explosion of possibility. So yes, at Ariantum, we want to see your genre work, but we don't just want to be excited by plot and character language. We also want to be startled to learn that what you've just done is even possible to do. Passing it on.
Thanks, Eric. Here's to more possibilities. All right, Annette, you're up next.
Alrighty, so yeah, my name is Annette Lyon. I have been writing seriously since 1994. I did a bunch of newspaper magazine stuff for the first several years. Had my first book come out with Covenant in 2002, which is, a couple decades now. I've been in the LDS market. I've done a lot of what has been billed as romance, but I have always felt that that didn't quite fit, and I've since embraced women's fiction as the title. That's more, it's kind of at the newer genre distinction. A lot of women's fiction with the Newport Ladies Book Club, which I co-wrote with Heather B. Moore, Josie Kilpack, and Julie Wright. There's 9 books in that series. Each of us wrote 2 of them, and then we co-wrote the final one in that. I did 4 historical novels that were all based on the 4 old Utah temples. And they had me do a chocolate cookbook, which was completely different, fun, but very different. And then in the middle of everything, it was kind of when like 50 Shades exploded, and suddenly the romance market nationally shifted very much toward the hot, spicy erotica stuff. And the only things on the other side were religious romance, inspirational romance. You get the Amish stuff and that kind of thing. And so Heather B. Moore and Sarah M. Eden and I, we saw a hole in the market. And so we decided to found a series that would help fill that hole. And so we did the Timeless Romance Anthologies. We just passed our 10th anniversary last fall in 2012. We've done an absolute, I don't even know how many dozens we've done now. But one of the collections hit the USA Today bestseller list. And we've definitely proved that there is a place for PG-13 romance without a religious element in it. We actually did have some LDS publishers asking if they could have some of the rights, and we said, "No, thank you," because we wanted to be able to have things like, characters toasting with champagne at a wedding, or just little things like that you couldn't do with an LDS publisher specifically. And we liked having the control. I have since also done, I've been a professional editor also for most of this time. I've done work with Precision Editing Group and Echelon Editing, and then just freelance on my own. A lot of that has been with Desert Books, Shadow Mountain titles. So I've seen a whole bunch of that across my desk over the years with a lot of insights. I've won a bunch of awards with the League of Utah Writers, a Whitney Award, stuff like that. As far as AML stuff goes, I actually, in 2002, Chris Bigelow was the editor of Ariantum, and he wanted to do a romance-themed issue, but he felt like he didn't know the genre and market all that well. And I had just barely published my first book that was basically romance. And so I felt strongly enough, because that was essentially most Mormon fiction at the time that was selling, like 80 to 90%, I would say at the time, was romance. And so I thought it needed to be done. And so I raised my hand and said I would edit that issue. So I did. And that was a lot of fun. So let's see what else. I've done some independent publishing. I have a grammar guide that I did on the request of a lot of colleagues who would always ask me how to use a semicolon, and then felt guilty and said, write a book so I don't have to ask you, and feel guilty. And then I've done World War II historical fiction. I have now dipped my toe into suspense thriller territory. I have a national title that just came out in March called Just One More. That's a women's fiction thriller. And that has been a whole lot of fun as well. So I've kind of done a whole bunch of different things over the years, but that's where I am.
Thanks, Annette. Now we're going to hear from Joe.
All right. I've done a number of things. Like Dave mentioned, I had a story published in All Made of Hinges, the first of the Mormon steampunk anthologies. And that's actually the only published story that I have so far. So all of my work has been in Mormon fiction as far as what's been published. I also am the managing editor at Hemmeline Publications. And one of the things we're doing is highlighting authors from what around here is called the Mormon Corridor. When I'm talking to people who may not know what that is, I say the Intermountain West, all the way up to Canada and down to Mexico. Basically, we publish collections of short fiction, poetry, essays, and whatnot by authors from this general area. A lot of them happen to be Mormon. Not all of them are. I think all of them so far have been, but let's see. And we also published one novel that a lot of people hadn't even heard of, called The Bacillus of Beauty. It's published in 1900 by a farmer's wife from Payson at a major New York publisher. And when I found it, I was asking around, anyone heard of this person? Anyone heard of this book? And nobody. It was crickets everywhere. So that one actually is, I guess, up for an award this year or something, or me for publishing it or something. I don't know exactly how to phrase that. But that's kind of my work in the field so far. I've done, I mean, I have a lot of things in the planning, so you can keep an eye on the Hemeline.com website to see more there. So that's about it for me. I'm pretty short and sweet. So.
Thanks, Joe. And last but certainly not least, considering how many genre fiction stories they've taken from me, is Jen, who is an editor with Dialogue.
Yeah, hi, I'm the fiction editor for Dialogue. I'm not quite sure how long I've been doing it for. I started in the middle of my doctorate, which I just finished up, and came on at a time when I was involved, just completely immersed in this research about the hegemony of English and of American universities over creative writing education. So I kind of brought that decolonizing activism with me when I took over this position at Dialogue. And Dialogue, the stuff that it was doing already felt like genre fiction to me. It felt like the Western genre. It had that setting. It had the male masculinity was the main thing to it. And so, like talking about shifting away from like the American realism and into genre, I felt like we were already a genre thing. So that looks different to me. I've never lived in the Intermountain West. I've never gone to school there. Acronyms people use really tangle me up. And so, yeah, I do love to publish stuff that could be considered genre, but it's just genres I like better than the Western. And Dialogue's an important, thing in the foundation there. My own writing, I have written 3 novels. One of them is a crime fiction novel. It's the least successful of all my novels, so I wouldn't say that I'm a success at genre fiction by any means. And in my academic work, I also teach popular fiction and cultural studies at the University of Alberta here in Edmonton, Canada, and I teach genre. And I agree with Derek that, yeah, this is something created by a cultural industry to optimize their efficiency and their profits. So it's something we can use as we see fit, but we're not bound by it because it's not really an ethical system. Anyway, I'm getting really off topic, but I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to get the word out that the genre we might be best known for in Dialogue, the Western, is no longer the thing that we're chiefly publishing anymore. The people who would write that for us are dying off, and they're not being replaced. And now Dialogue is competing with all these excellent new venues. Eric, I didn't know you were taking on my fiction. We've never had lower submissions. The board and my editor Taylor Petrie have been very patient with me trying to revamp this program, but it's taking time. So I want your stuff. Send me your stuff before I drive this fiction program right into the ground. Help me out. All right, that's it. Thanks.
Thanks, Jen. You heard her. Write some awesome stories and send them to Dialogue. Okay. I had a bunch of meaty questions that I gave to the panelists beforehand, and we are obviously not going to have time to go through all of them. But I do want to at least talk about this first piece before we get on to a couple else, which is kind of making the case for Mormons writing genre fiction, whether it's overtly Mormon or not. Why should Mormons write genre fiction. You know what, Annette, do you mind starting us off? Do you have some thoughts?
I guess I will. So why Mormons should write genre fiction? It's one of those things I think that everybody should write. I mean, any demographic should, because there's just so much. There's just so much you can do and explore and invent and all that. But I think we have a distinct worldview that's it's Christian and yet something else. I think there's some elements of Judaism, but something else. I think that Mormonness is largely responsible for Brandon Sanderson's huge success, because his books are not overtly LDS themed at all. And yes, he is a machine as far as work ethic and that kind of thing. But there are elements to his stories where you're like, gee, that sounds a little bit like the Book of Mormon, or oh, that's plates with records on them. He has these things inform our writing, whether or not we're conscious of it. And I think that brings a completely different perspective to literature that I think is valuable just because it is unique and there's no one else who can write it besides someone who's inside that faith.
Thanks, Annette. I'm going to ask Dave to talk now. Can you address my questions about why?
Well, let me offer some reasons why I think Mormons should specifically write science fiction and fantasy. I'm not a big Western reader, but someone else can make that case. So, with respect to fantasy literature in particular, fantasy is the what-if literature of the human spirit, and we could have really long, interesting conversations. We won't have time for that, but etymologically, the word magic, where it goes back to is it means literally other people's spirituality. And fantasy literature, by engaging in magic, magical ideas, in the tools of analogy and wonder and narrative structure, is an exploration of the parts of the human spirit that we don't necessarily see. And we have a wonderfully rich tradition that is spiritual and that is scriptural and that is dense with magical ideas and experiences, and that from a fictional point of view is largely unexplored. And I think that represents a huge part of our unconscious mind that we're just not looking at. And I think this is the role of art. And I think young people should be writing, Mormons should be writing, should be engaging with ideas of fantasy and wonder in literature of the fantastic. Science fiction is the what-if literature of science and technology, but also social organization. And, there we have these wonderful roots in and connections with utopian kind of movements of the 19th century and earlier. And again, I think that if we want to understand our own culture and our relationship to others and what we have to offer and what our ideas mean, that the sort of eisegesis that we go through, where we say, I've been assigned to read to you the talk by Elder J. Humpty Dumpterson and comment upon the talk this week, will not do it, right? And so I think that writing science fiction and fantasy literature is an imperative. It's an urgent task, and I invite you to do it.
Thanks, Dave. I want to turn to Joe now, specifically because he has put together this editorial series of writers in the Intermountain West region, and so talk a little bit more about why you're doing that and why you think it's important.
Well, addressing the initial question first. I think science fiction and fantasy give authors a way to discuss elements of religion and culture in a more safe way, I guess, the way most people would view it, where they can approach it without feeling like they're being preached at or something like that. So you can introduce elements into it that help people, well, it helps demystify the culture and the religion a bit, because say you create a Mormon character in your book, you can have them doing certain things and maybe talking about certain things that help people get a better understanding of it. One thing that I always think of when people say, well, how would you like to do that? I point to all the Jewish science fiction and fantasy anthologies there are out there, and all the different stories that have Jewish characters in them. And that's the kind of thing I want for Mormon. So that people can better understand it and get more flavor, so it becomes more commonly known, I guess. Because I know from a lot of those stories that I've read, I've learned a lot of things about Jewish people that I didn't know about, because I don't really know that many of them in person. I don't see them. I know I have quite a number of online friends who are Jewish, but I don't see them all that often because they live in New York or somewhere else that's quite a ways away from where I live. And so I don't get the chance to meet up with them and just chat with them. And so a lot of the ways that I've learned about that culture is through fiction. And I mean, I know that that's not necessarily 100% accurate all the time, but there are, I mean, a lot of the stories are written by Jewish authors. And so I think the same kind of thing can be done with Mormon authors, where they present bits and pieces of the culture to help people gain a better understanding of who we are, so that the broader society can learn about that more. And then that's kind of the same thing that I'm trying to do with the Legacy of the Corridor series, is to introduce people to authors they may have heard of or maybe even not heard of, and help them find all the different ways that people are writing about their cultures, because every individual person has their own culture too, that's influenced by all their life experiences and the people around them. And so even all of us, for example, who are all somehow connected to Mormonness, all have different experiences, all have different views on things. And so by introducing people to a wide variety of really well-known people, like Dave, who's super well-known, and other authors like Harriet Stark, who I still haven't run into anybody who'd heard of her before I ran across her and started asking about her. There's all kinds of different people that can be introduced to authors around here and the great work that they're doing. So
Thanks, Joe. And I'll just put in a personal plug that Harriet Stark's Bacillus of Beauty is a fascinating work of fiction, and you should definitely check it out. Jen, did you have any thoughts on my question? Sorry, I was asking Jen if, yeah.
Oh, me? Sorry, I was muted. I'm a dum-dum. Can you repeat the question? I was listening to Joe and I lost the original.
Of course, yes. It is, why should Mormons engage with genre fiction? Why should they write genre fiction, whether it's overtly about Mormonism or not?
Well, Joe's approach is an important one. It's kind of like the preservation of something that already exists. And I think that writing genre fiction also can develop something which doesn't exist yet, and that is a Mormon literature further from this corridor that we're talking about here. And if we stick to the minimalist realism of the kind of stories, dialogue collected, and the stuff that Mormon literature, I don't know if you can call it a discipline or whatever, is built on. If we want to get past that, it's really hard to bring people in from outside the area, partly because of the very minimalism and realism of it. You have to be literate in that area and the way it works, and you have to know where the Lee Library, I assume Lee Library is on BYU campus, is that right? I don't even know. And I'm someone who's been working in Mormon literature for about a decade now, and if I don't know, someone writing their very first story and trying to get it published in the Mormon sphere is not going to know. And it's going to be alienating and disorienting for them if that's the only thing that's there. When we start writing the genre fiction, like Dave says, there are certain universals in the spiritual experience in general and in the church experience, both the negative and positive experiences people have with it as faith, that transcends the minimalism and the realism. And it's something that we have in common, that for me, as someone who, frankly, that area does not mean a lot to me, culturally, emotionally, in any way. I should still be allowed in Mormon literature, and I have been. I've been well received and given responsibilities, and there's a million more of me out there, and people who are even less like me, people for whom English is not their first language, who didn't grow up on top of the United States thinking about it all the time, who didn't watch its television and stuff when they were growing up. And if we get away from having to be literate in Mormon culture in order to participate in the literature, we're going to have a broader Mormon literature. We're going to have something more like we've always wanted before. And I think the preservation of that culture, like Joe says, is important, but there's this other side of it. And getting into things where you don't have to imitate the voice of what people think of as the dialogue story. If you don't have to, if you don't have to submit to being colonized culturally by that, we're going to have more people, we're going to have better stories, and we're going to have that universal aspect that I find I wasn't seeing when I looked at these stories, and it felt like a Western genre to me. So yeah, like it's everything. It's the only way we're going to be able to talk to each other as a global community.
Thanks, Jen. Speaking of the global community, I just want to briefly mention, if you haven't heard of it, I assume most people who are viewing this, at least those viewing this live, have the Mormon Lit List has done some amazing work with finding Mormon authors, work for Mormon authors from across the globe, and their next set of stories will do the same. I'm going to ask Eric, I'm going to set him up a task that I'm hoping and believe he's up for, which is talk about specifically mixing up the Mormonism overtly in the genre, if you're willing to do that. Why should we do that?
Okay, I'll start by talking about Added Upon, Nephi Anderson's first novel, and a really important book in terms of the development of our own literature. And it's really possible to read Added Upon not as a novel, but as a series of novellas in different genres. You have your romance, you have your utopian. Each section of the book is engaging with a different set of tropes from his era. And what it resulted in? It resulted in the birth of home literature in a very real way. It proved that there could be ambition. I mean, you can disagree about how good Added Upon is, but you can't deny its ambition. Like it swung really big, and it attempted really important things, and had a boldness that we all should aspire to. And one of the things he did, and I'm not sure it was great, but there's been some cultural effects of his speculative theology. There's going to be a panel later in this conference about poetry's role in speculative theology, which I'm talking about all the time. Like poetry, poets are our version of the prophets in the desert. It's a really important thing, but fiction generally, and the genre specifically, are also really powerful avenues for us to engage in speculative theology. It's impossible to write about the millennium, say, using only scriptural canon as your source. We just don't have enough. And if these ideas matter, if our religious ideas matter and we need to explore them, then fiction and poetry and the genres are some of the very best tools we have. That's why we had the issue on the plan, because I really believed people would have interesting things to say about our theology of the plan of salvation, and they did. I mean, there are more and more theologians in the Mormon scene right now, and that's great. But there are probably way more people who've already read Witchy Eye than are ever going to read the entire any of the books in the Brief Theological Introduction series. Great as they are, like there's just a bigger audience for exploring interesting ideas through fiction, and the genres are just so well equipped for that.
Thanks, Eric. I knew you could do that. I would like to actually get to a little bit of the future part. And so I'm going to ask this question, and this is one where kind of unmute yourself if you have some thoughts. I won't call out on everybody, but it's what kinds of genre literature would you like to see that you currently aren't seeing? And we can be as broad or specific as we'd like in terms of what the genres are and what we'd like to see and in what form we'd like to see them. Anybody want to have some thoughts on that? Want to give that
I'll sort this off real fast because I just have a very small comment. In Ariantum so far, almost all the genre work we've seen has been either science fiction or horror. And that's great because I love those and I think they are really interesting. We've had one mystery story, but I think that for Ariantum specifically, there's so many other genres and they all offer different things to the audience. And so I'd like to see what else we can do. And I know part of that is a recognition that I haven't read as widely as I should have, but I just love to see what it looks like when really specific Mormon stories are flown in a lot of different genres.
See, you heard it there. Stop sending your horror and your sci-fi to Eric. Send it to me at Dialogue. I would love to have more of that stuff. The closest we really get to sci-fi is post-apocalyptic and like magical realism, like William has. I basically published everything he sends me. But yeah, I'd love to see something that was a little more in line with a true genre work in either of those. So hit me up, come on. And romance is interesting as well. We're looking for more stories by women. We kind of had this bad situation we fell into where women stand for something in all our stories, and you know they show the man's responsibility or his fear or whatever. Stop that. I really like it when women speak in their own voices, when they like sex, when they are funny, all these things. So why not have like a full-blown romance? I would love that. Send me your romance. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jen. I think
On-
Annette wants to talk about that, and then Joe wanted to say something.
Yes,
so go ahead, Annette.
Just very briefly, just on top of the romance thing, we have had an explosion of Regency romance, and that was somewhat thanks to Sarah and getting in with Covenant and Kirkshaw really championing her, and then exploded. At the time, publishers were like, "Oh, that's kind of a risk," and I'm like, "Do you know Mormon women and Jane Austen? Like, no, this is not a risk." But everyone's publishing it now. So Regency by definition is the early 1800s and it ends before 1830. So it cannot be Mormon fiction by that definition. I would like to see romance that's a little bit later that actually is Mormon fiction, that's into the Victorian era and even into the Edwardian when you get into past 1900. That hasn't really been explored yet, and bringing in the Mormon elements to that.
I agree. And even in the larger romance genres, so I've read my fair share of Regency and Edwardian romance. I did not find a lot of Gilded Age romance novels, and to me that's a fascinating period of history. It shows up in my own work, and I think especially for Mormonism, a lot of the Mormon romance that currently exists is historical romance that oftentimes takes place on the frontier or in the Nauvoo era, and I would love to see some Gilded Age romance. Okay, Joe, what did you want to say?
Kind of the things that I've been trying to do with a lot of the stuff that I've been publishing, where I'm putting together collections and anthologies and stuff, is I want to see kind of more positive outlooks on the future, because I think we're drowning in the dystopian, post-apocalyptic, everything's horrible, we're all going to die and it sucks and all that. I think there's way too much of that. I think there's a place for that, but I think we need more that shows people overcoming those horrible things and not just curling up in a ball and dying at the end of the story or whatever, because I've seen too much of that. And so that's one of the big things that I'm looking for, is positive stuff where people are doing things and finding good ways to solve whatever the problem is in the story and ending up with a positive outcome at the end of the story. You know, not necessarily happily ever after, because there are always problems that come up, but just positive outlooks, generally not dystopian and definitely not utopian, because that's mostly a pipe dream. But that's mainly what I'm looking for.
Thanks, Joe. I do know that there are quite a few, or at least several Mormon authors and just Mormons in general who are interested in one strand of that kind of more hopeful near fiction, science fiction. Sometimes under it's called solar punk is one label that's used for it. And so I think we're going to see more of that in the future for sure. But also, if you're interested in writing that kind of thing, that's certainly a genre to take out or to check out. Dave, looks like you want to say something.
Am I correct to think we're done in like 3 minutes? Or do we go to the quarter after?
We can go a little bit longer. We don't have any programming after us, and
Okay.
we did get started.
So I just wanted to make this comment because I didn't know if we're going to really sort of get to this question at all. I'm not sure that the prospects for Mormon writers on the whole are any better than they were 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. I think looking at an individual, so physics, okay, physics tells us that all bodies exert gravitational pull on other bodies, okay? And the bigger the body is, the more pull it exerts. And in fact, actually they distort space and time and light so that really big bodies make it impossible to see. And Brandon Sanderson is the black hole of fantasy literature. And people see him and go, Mormons have it made. No, you're not going to be Brandon Sanderson any more than to be J.K. Rowling, okay? So I think there's reasons to be optimistic in the ecosystem. I think there are institutions that are trying to help and promote Mormon literature, okay? I think the better reason to be optimistic is that there are a lot of other Mormon writers out there, and it's easy to do things to find them. I on a quarterly cadence do two things. I open up my house to have public speakers come to my house and talk about whatever. Okay, I had a guy come talk about the Aztecs 6 weeks ago. In 6 weeks, I'm going to have a guy come talk about Joseph Smith's magical career. 3 months after that, I'm going to have a Dominican priest who's also a Knight Commander of the Order of the Holy Sepulchre come. I don't even know what he's going to talk about. And writers show up. That's who comes to these, my neighbors and writers, right? Every 3 months, I just tell people I'm going to show up at IHOP on Saturday at 1 o'clock, and like 20 to 50 writers show up. People are out there, okay? And you can network peer-to-peer, and you can find other writers and writing groups and editors and even publishing contracts and stuff that way. But look, fundamentally, I don't think it's any easier than it used to be, with maybe this one exception. The revolution in publishing that has made self-publishing so cheap and ubiquitous has generated a lot of crap. But also, it empowers anybody with a vision. If you really want to say something, okay, if you really want to tell a story, they really can't stop you, short of you offending Amazon, which you can do. But if you play by their rules, they're pretty much not going to. You can put your book out there, and that is amazing. And you can basically do it for free, and that is amazing. So I think that's a wonderfully optimistic development. And I would say, hey, don't worry about. You'll find the institutions. You'll figure out the publishers over time. Do the work you have to do on your own spiritual path. Write the thing that is non-fungible to you, that is your story that nobody else could write, and be brave. You know, the odds of you being a commercial success are smaller than the odds of being hit by lightning. The odds of you being Brandon Sanderson are smaller than the odds of being hit by lightning 10 times in a row, okay? That's not the goal. The goal is to say something true and important and then stand by it. And you can do that.
Kind of going off of that, I think the biggest thing that authors can do is to tell interesting and engaging stories with interesting characters and basically things that will hold a reader's attention. That should be number one on the list for whenever an author is writing a story, really. If they have some message that they want to get out to, that's fine, as long as it doesn't interfere with the story being interesting and engaging. And if an author wants to be successful, whether they're submitting to traditional publishers or going the self-publishing route, writing good stories, good solid writing is going to do more for you than anything else.
Thanks. Anybody else want to comment on kind of what the published environment looks like or could look like in the near future? Barriers, reasons for optimism, what we should be doing, what we should not be doing.
Little thought here as we're talking. One thing that has struck me over the years, in the 2 decades I've been in the market, is one reason we're not getting, I think, My Name is Asher Lev type books on the national market is because a lot of Mormon writers start with, the Mormon publishers, and then they're bound to them contractually for anything that's Mormon themed, Mormon character, Mormon story. So they have to break into writing something that's not at all overtly Mormon in any way, shape, or form if they're going to go to a national publisher. So I think that's a place to start start getting rid of those clauses. I think some of the contracts are better now than they used to be. And then another issue that I think is a problem is more of a cultural thing. When you look at other faiths, there's levels of orthodoxy and Catholicism and Judaism and all of these things. And for us, we don't really have those levels. It's kind of you're in or you're out. And if you're out of the fold, in a sense, and you can be seen that way just because you're publishing something that's not as 100% faith promoting as a reader might want, then it's not okay to read it. So suddenly the audience is being limited because your own people aren't reading something that maybe they could really benefit from and really love and enjoy and open their brains on, because it's either you're 100% Orthodox or people view it as anti. And that's a cultural problem, I think, that we just kind of need to deal with.
Thanks for that. Yeah, that's important points. Anybody else have any thoughts about, yeah, Jen?
Thanks, Annette. I agree with that. And the reviewing system in church publications, I'm thinking of my personal experience with Deseret News, they are just stoking that kind of binary look at Mormon literature. And I had a reviewer who, does not give me my Temple Recommend interview every 2 years, but felt qualified to say that my first novel was not with the church, and obviously this author is not Orthodox or whatever she says. Of course, she wouldn't use the word Orthodox, and I wrote back to them. I've never written back to a reviewer, but at the time, I'm not an angsty Mormon. I'm all in, and I was like hurt to my core by being called out in public in the church's owned newspaper as not a good member. Like, how am I going to go to my young women I'm the president of and, have this hanging around on Google about me? Well, it's still up on the web and everything. But they did, acknowledge that this was inappropriate for her to make that kind of statement about a human being. And that's just one small book 10 years ago, something that happened to me. So it is a community thing and a re-education of readers who can be extremely petty and close-minded and are looking for, it's our own metaphor, to circle wagons and keep things in. And then on the other side, reading as I do for dialogue, just the extremely mean-spirited content I get from people who are out of the church now. Like I just saw something where it was about polygamy, and one of the points, for no reason I could tell, was that the women in this polygamous family didn't love their children. Why? Why would you do that? And it's just seems mean to me. So it's on both sides of it. And my own example of the feelings being so deeply held, and this is right at the core of people, where they live and where they feel things. So yeah, we have this also going on in this market, in this culture, if you want to call it that. And we all probably review books as well as edit and publish and write. And I don't know, maybe it's up for people with an interest in this to lead the way in showing how to review something in a way that does not, give it a rating on the American movie scale or whatever, and just make it so people are scared to read their own literature.
That's funny. I was on a panel at LTUE once where the question was asked, what influence do you take from Mormonism in your writing? And there was a very large numbers publishing fellow on the panel, not Brandon, who said, "Oh, I'm just grateful that I can write things that comply with standards," which I've always thought is ridiculous, because my faith comes from a book which opens, one of the opening sequences is a guy who sneaks into a city in the dead of night and, listening to a voice in his head, chops off the head of his relative, right? And the plot goes downhill from there. We have genocide, and we have kidnappings, and we have people burned alive in pits. And at the end of the book, we have cannibal rape, right? Like, where does standards come into this? Where is the gospel of Jesus Christ somehow like a wall that we will see no evil and hear no evil? But I think the answer has to be, if this is a problem, you're the one who has to push back against it, right? You as an editor, you as a publisher, you as a writer need to push by writing, by publishing, for a broader understanding, for what you think is a truer understanding. It's more reason to write.
So I will also say that, having been involved with the Whitney Awards, I've been pleased to see that we have made some progress here. There was one book several years ago, I remember reading it thinking, this deserves the award in its category. It just does, but it won't get it because there was a steamy sex scene in it. I don't think it was erotica, but it was way beyond what you'd see in, some more standard publishers for the Mormon market. And it did win. And I was kind of floored. I was like, oh my gosh, this is great, and then some horror has won and things like that. So I think we are making some progress. So I want to kind of give that the due on that part. We're not entirely jerks, but there is work to be done.
I just want to throw out there that we have the advantage now. Mormon literature has existed for over 100 years. And so we also have history. Stephen Carter wrote a great book that came out last year about Virginia Sorensen, and Michael Austin also wrote one about Bartis Fisher, and how and they were dealing with some of these same issues in different ways. There's a different time. I'm not equating them, but one advantage we have now is we have like a literary history, and we can see how other people have dealt with it. And we also have a huge advantage they have, in that it's really easy to find your people if you look nowadays. And I think the big lesson we learn is that this may be the era of fractured audiences, but that means that no matter who you are and no matter what you write, there are people who care about what you do and will understand it in the right way. There'll also be the other people, but that's okay.
Thanks, Eric. I think we'll wrap things up here. We could talk about this for a lot more time, and we will talk in further sessions of the conference. But I just want to thank everybody, Annette, Joe, Dave, Eric, and Jen for kicking us off for this conference, and hope to see you all in future sessions.